The general's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage. After 3 decades of serving his country, he was being treated like a criminal in a bank parking lot by cops who thought his military ID was fake. But they had no idea who they were really dealing with, and the phone call he was about to make would bring the full weight of the U.S. military crashing down on their heads. The summer heat pressed down on the asphalt like a weight, shimmering in waves that made the suburban street look like it was breathing. General Marcus Washington stepped out of his silver Honda Civic, the metal door clicking shut behind him with the same precision he'd carried through 32 years of military service. He wore a simple polo shirt and khakis, civilian clothes that felt foreign after decades in uniform, but necessary for this quiet Saturday afternoon errand to the bank. The parking lot stretched before him, half empty under the blazing sun, when the first police cruiser pulled up. Then another. The engines cut simultaneously, and 4 officers emerged with the kind of coordinated movement that made Marcus's trained eye narrow. He recognized the choreography. This wasn't random. Officer Derek Hoffman stepped forward first, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. Behind him, 3 younger officers fanned out in a practiced formation that would have impressed Marcus if it weren't being used against him. The badge on Hoffman's chest caught the sunlight as he approached, his pale face already flushed red from the heat, and something else. Something that made Marcus's stomach tighten with a familiar, bitter recognition. "Sir, we need you to put your hands where we can see them," Hoffman called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot with enough volume to turn heads. A woman loading groceries into her SUV stopped mid-motion, her mouth falling open. A teenager on a skateboard rolled to a halt, pulling out his phone. Marcus raised his hands slowly, the movement deliberate and controlled. 32 years of commanding respect from soldiers of every background. 32 years of earning salutes and leading men into combat zones. And here he stood in a suburban parking lot with his hands in the air like a common criminal. The irony tasted like copper in his mouth. "What seems to be the problem, officers?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. He'd faced enemy fire in 3 different countries, had stared down insurgents and navigated political minefields in the Pentagon. But this moment, this humiliation in broad daylight, felt different, more personal, more dangerous. Hoffman stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the coffee on his breath and see the small scar above his left eyebrow. "We received reports of a suspicious individual matching your description casing vehicles in this area. We're going to need to search you." The lie hung in the air between them like smoke. Marcus had been in the parking lot for less than 2 minutes, had walked directly from his car toward the bank entrance without so much as glancing at another vehicle. But he also knew that pointing out the obvious fabrication would only escalate a situation that was already spiraling beyond reason. "I'm here to make a deposit at the bank," Marcus said, gesturing toward the building with a slight nod. "I have identification if you need to see it." "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Hoffman ordered, ignoring Marcus's words entirely. The other officers moved closer, forming a tighter circle that blocked most of the parking lot's view. But not all of it. Marcus could see more phones appearing, more faces turning their way, more witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. As Marcus turned to face his car, placing his palms flat against the warm metal, he caught his reflection in the window. The face looking back at him belonged to a man who had briefed presidents, who had medals locked away in a safe at home, who had earned the respect of generals and admirals across the globe. But in this moment, in this parking lot, none of that mattered. He was just another black man with his hands on a car, surrounded by white officers who seemed determined to prove a point that had nothing to do with justice. The search began with rough, unnecessary force. Hoffman's hands moved over Marcus's body with deliberate aggression, checking pockets that clearly contained nothing more threatening than a wallet and car keys. The other officers watched, their faces masks of professional indifference that barely concealed something uglier underneath. "What do we have here?" Hoffman said, pulling Marcus's wallet from his back pocket. He flipped it open, and Marcus watched in the car window's reflection as the officer's expression changed. The military ID was right there, impossible to miss, along with the Pentagon access card that Marcus had forgotten to remove after his retirement ceremony 3 months ago. But instead of the apology that any reasonable person might expect, Hoffman's face hardened further. He held up the ID, showing it to his fellow officers with a smirk that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Looks like we got ourselves a stolen valor case, boys," Hoffman announced loud enough for the growing crowd of onlookers to hear. "This here's a fake military ID, probably stolen off some real hero." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. In all his years of service, through all the challenges and obstacles he'd faced as a black officer rising through the ranks, no one had ever questioned his right to wear the uniform. No one had ever suggested that his achievements were anything other than earned through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication to his country. Marcus turned around slowly, his hands still raised, his eyes meeting Hoffman's with a steady gaze that had once made enemy combatants think twice about their life choices. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. If you'll just run that ID through your system." "The only misunderstanding here is you thinking you can impersonate a military officer in my jurisdiction," Hoffman cut him off. "That's a federal crime, son. You're looking at serious time." The word son dripped with condescension, and Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not anger. He'd learned long ago to control that particular emotion, but a cold, calculating fury that had served him well in combat situations. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a deliberate attempt to destroy everything he'd worked for, everything he'd earned, everything he was. The crowd was growing larger now, phones recording from multiple angles, voices beginning to murmur with confusion and outrage. Marcus could hear fragments of conversation. "That's not right," and "they can't do that," and "someone should call someone." But no one stepped forward. No one intervened. They just watched and recorded, turning his humiliation into content for their social media feeds. Hoffman was enjoying himself now. Marcus could see it in the way the officer's shoulders relaxed, in the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This was power, pure and simple. The power to reduce a decorated general to nothing more than a suspect in a parking lot, to strip away decades of service and achievement with nothing more than an accusation and a badge. "You know what I think?" Hoffman said, stepping closer until he was almost nose to nose with Marcus. "I think you found this ID somewhere. Maybe picked it off a real soldier's body overseas. Wouldn't be the first time some lowlife tried to cash in on a hero's sacrifice." The insult was designed to provoke a reaction, Marcus knew. Hoffman wanted him to swing, wanted him to give them an excuse to escalate this encounter into something that would end with Marcus face down on the asphalt, or worse. But Marcus had faced down enemy fire and political enemies with equal composure. He wasn't about to let a small-town cop with a superiority complex break 32 years of discipline. Instead, Marcus did something that clearly wasn't in Hoffman's playbook. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile or a submissive one. It was the smile of a man who had just realized that his opponents had made a critical tactical error. It was the smile of someone who knew something that the other side didn't, something that was about to change the entire dynamic of this encounter. "Officer Hoffman," Marcus said, reading the name tag with deliberate precision. "I'm going to reach into my front pocket now, very slowly, and I'm going to pull out my phone. I think there's someone you should meet." Before you continue with this powerful story of justice and redemption, take a moment to like this video. If you believe in standing up for what's right, share it with someone who needs to see that truth always finds a way to surface, and subscribe to Acts of Depth for more stories that remind us of the strength of the human spirit when faced with injustice. Hoffman's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon as Marcus reached slowly into his front pocket. The other officers tensed, their training kicking in as they prepared for what they assumed would be a threat. But Marcus's movements were deliberate, controlled, the actions of a man who had spent decades diffusing volatile situations rather than escalating them. The phone that emerged was nothing special, a standard smartphone with a cracked screen protector that Marcus had been meaning to replace for months. But as he held it up, his thumb hovering over the contact list, Hoffman's confident smirk began to waver. There was something in Marcus's demeanor, a quiet certainty that suggested this wasn't going to end the way the officer had planned. "I'm going to make one phone call," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used to brief Joint Chiefs and coordinate military operations across 3 continents. "Just one. And then we're going to see how this situation really plays out." Hoffman laughed, but it sounded forced now, hollow. "You think calling your lawyer is going to help you? This is cut and dried, pal. Impersonating a military officer, carrying false identification. You're going away for a long time." Marcus scrolled through his contacts, past family members and old colleagues, past the names of senators and congressmen he'd worked with during his Pentagon years, until he found the one he was looking for. The name on the screen was simple: General Patricia Hayes, Chairman, Joint Chiefs. He pressed the call button and put the phone on speaker. The crowd had grown larger now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Someone had called the local news, and Marcus could see a van with a television station logo pulling into the parking lot. The teenager with the skateboard was live streaming on social media, his viewer count climbing rapidly as word spread about what was happening. This wasn't just a local incident anymore. It was becoming something much bigger. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, a crisp, professional voice answered. "General Hayes." "Patricia, it's Marcus Washington," he said, his eyes never leaving Hoffman's face. "I'm sorry to bother you on a Saturday, but I find myself in a rather unusual situation." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Marcus could almost hear the wheels turning in his former colleague's mind. General Patricia Hayes was not a woman who was easily surprised, but the tone in Marcus's voice clearly caught her attention. "Marcus? What's going on? You sound like you're on speaker." "I am. I'm currently standing in a parking lot in Millbrook, surrounded by 4 police officers who seem to believe that my military identification is fake. They've accused me of stolen valor and are threatening to arrest me for impersonating an officer." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus watched as Hoffman's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, doubt, and then the first flicker of genuine concern. The other officers exchanged glances, their confident postures beginning to shift, as they realized they might have stepped into something far more complicated than a routine harassment. When General Hayes spoke again, her voice had taken on the steel edge that Marcus remembered from their days working together in the Pentagon. It was the voice she used when dealing with foreign dignitaries who had overstepped their bounds, or when congressional committees tried to play political games with military funding. "Officer," she said, her words cutting through the summer air like a blade, "I'm going to assume that one of you is in charge of this situation. Would that person please identify themselves?" Hoffman cleared his throat, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. "This is Officer Derek Hoffman, Millbrook Police Department. Ma'am, we're conducting a routine investigation." "Officer Hoffman," General Hayes interrupted, "let me be very clear about something. The man you have detained is General Marcus Washington, United States Army, retired. He served with distinction for 32 years, including 3 combat deployments and 5 years as my direct subordinate in the Pentagon. He has briefed presidents, commanded thousands of soldiers, and has more medals in his closet than your entire department has collectively earned in its existence." The parking lot had gone completely silent, except for the sound of traffic in the distance and the quiet hum of phone cameras recording every word. Marcus could see the exact moment when the reality of the situation hit Hoffman, the way his shoulders sagged, the way his hand fell away from his weapon, the way his face went pale beneath his summer tan. "Furthermore," General Hayes continued, her voice gaining momentum like an avalanche, "General Washington's identification is not only genuine, it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States military. His Pentagon access card, which I assume you've also questioned, was issued by my office personally. So unless you're suggesting that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is involved in some sort of elaborate fraud scheme, I suggest you reconsider your position." One of the younger officers, Marcus could see his name tag read Patterson, took a step backward, his face flushed with embarrassment. Another officer, a woman who looked like she might be a supervisor, was speaking urgently into her radio, probably trying to reach someone higher up the chain of command who could help them figure out how to extract themselves from this disaster. But Hoffman wasn't ready to give up yet. Marcus could see the stubborn pride in the man's eyes, the refusal to admit that he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. It was the same look Marcus had seen in the eyes of enemy commanders who continued fighting even when their positions were hopeless, who chose destruction over surrender. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Hoffman said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "I don't know who you are or what your relationship is to this individual. Anyone can claim to be anyone on a phone call. What I know is that we have a suspicious person in our jurisdiction, and we're going to handle this according to our protocols." The mistake was immediate and obvious. Marcus actually winced, knowing what was coming next. In all his years of military service, he had never seen anyone challenge General Patricia Hayes's authority and walk away unscathed. She was a woman who had earned her position through sheer competence and iron will, who had stared down foreign generals and domestic politicians with equal effectiveness. "Officer Hoffman," she said, and her voice had dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout, "you just made the second biggest mistake of your career. The first was detaining General Washington in the first place. But questioning my identity and authority? That's going to have consequences that extend far beyond your little jurisdiction." Marcus watched as Hoffman's face went through another series of changes. The man was beginning to realize that he wasn't just dealing with a case of mistaken identity anymore. He was dealing with the full weight of the United States military establishment, and he had managed to antagonize one of the most powerful people in that establishment. "I want you to listen very carefully," General Hayes continued. "In approximately 10 minutes, you're going to receive a phone call from your chief of police. Shortly after that, you're going to receive a call from your mayor. And if this situation isn't resolved to my satisfaction within the next 15 minutes, you're going to receive a visit from a convoy of military vehicles that will make your little traffic stops look like a children's game." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Marcus could see the exact moment when Hoffman realized that this wasn't a bluff, that the woman on the other end of the phone had the authority and the will to follow through on every word she'd spoken. But even as the officer's resolve began to crumble, Marcus could see something else in his eyes. A desperate anger. The fury of a man who had been publicly humiliated and was looking for a way to salvage his pride. It was a dangerous combination, and Marcus had seen it lead to violence more times than he cared to remember. The crowd was pressing closer now, sensing that something significant was happening. The news van had parked, and Marcus could see a reporter and cameraman setting up their equipment. Social media notifications were pinging constantly from phones throughout the crowd as the live stream gained viewers and the story began to spread across the internet. This was no longer just about one man's harassment in a parking lot. This was becoming a symbol, a moment that would be dissected and analyzed and remembered long after the summer heat had faded. And Marcus knew that how it ended would matter not just for him, but for every person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. The first sign that General Hayes wasn't bluffing came exactly 8 minutes later, when Officer Patterson's radio crackled to life with an urgency that made everyone in the parking lot freeze. The voice on the other end was sharp, clipped, and clearly belonged to someone who was not having a good day. "All units, this is Chief Morrison. I need Officer Hoffman to respond immediately. We have a situation that requires immediate resolution." Hoffman's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his radio. The confident swagger that had carried him through the first part of this encounter had completely evaporated, replaced by the hunched posture of a man who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "This is Hoffman, Chief. I'm currently engaged in a routine stop." "Hoffman, shut up and listen!" Chief Morrison's voice cut through the static like a knife. "I just got off the phone with the Pentagon." "The Pentagon? Hoffman, do you understand what that means?" Marcus watched the color drain from Hoffman's face as the reality of his situation finally sank in. Around them, the crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, with more arriving every minute as word spread through social media and local news alerts. The teenager with the skateboard was providing live commentary to his thousands of viewers, his voice breathless with excitement as he narrated what was clearly the biggest story to hit Millbrook in decades. "I need you to release General Washington immediately," Chief Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of a man whose career was flashing before his eyes. "I need you to apologize to him personally. And then I need you to get back to the station so we can discuss how you managed to create an international incident in a bank parking lot." International incident. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus could see Hoffman processing the implications, understanding for the first time that this wasn't just about local politics or departmental procedures. This was about the relationship between civilian law enforcement and the military, about respect and protocol, and the kind of diplomatic considerations that could make or break careers. But even as his fellow officers began to step back, even as the supervisor continued her urgent radio conversations with what sounded like increasingly panicked superiors, Hoffman's jaw set with stubborn defiance. Marcus recognized the look. He'd seen it in the faces of soldiers who were about to make catastrophically bad decisions, who chose pride over wisdom even when the consequences were obvious. "Chief, I don't care if this guy knows the president himself," Hoffman said into his radio, his voice rising with desperate anger. "He was acting suspicious. He matches the description of a suspect, and I'm not going to be intimidated by some phone calls from Washington." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the distant sound of highway traffic and the gentle hum of air conditioning units from the nearby buildings. Even the crowd seemed to hold its breath, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. When Chief Morrison's voice came back over the radio, it carried a tone that Marcus had heard before, the sound of a superior officer delivering news that would end a career. "Hoffman, you're relieved of duty effective immediately. Turn in your badge and weapon to Sergeant Martinez and report to my office Monday morning for disciplinary proceedings. And Hoffman, start looking for a new job." The radio went silent. For a moment, nobody moved. Hoffman stood frozen, his hand still gripping the radio, his face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and dawning comprehension. The other officers looked like they wanted to disappear into the asphalt, their eyes fixed on anything except their former colleague's public humiliation. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came a sound that made everyone's head turn toward the main road. It was low at first, barely audible over the ambient noise of the suburban afternoon, but it grew steadily louder and more distinct. The rumble of heavy engines. Multiple heavy engines. Marcus smiled, recognizing the sound immediately. He'd heard it countless times during his military career. The distinctive growl of military vehicles moving in convoy formation. General Hayes hadn't been making idle threats. She was following through on her promise with the kind of precision and overwhelming force that had made her one of the most respected military leaders of her generation. The first Humvee appeared at the intersection, its olive drab paint and military markings unmistakable even from a distance. Behind it came another, then another, until a full convoy of 6 vehicles was turning into the shopping center parking lot with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of serious military planning. The crowd's murmur rose to an excited buzz as people pulled out phones and began recording the unprecedented sight of U.S. military vehicles rolling through suburban Millbrook on a Saturday afternoon. The news crew scrambled to get better angles, their reporter speaking rapidly into her microphone as she tried to convey the surreal nature of what was unfolding. The lead Humvee pulled up directly in front of the group, its engine idling with mechanical authority. The door opened, and out stepped a figure that made Marcus's chest swell with pride and vindication. Colonel James Rodriguez, Marcus's former aide-de-camp, emerged in full dress uniform, his bearing crisp and professional despite the summer heat. Behind him came 5 more soldiers, all in dress uniforms, all moving with the kind of disciplined precision that spoke of elite training and absolute professionalism. They formed a line facing the police officers, their presence transforming the parking lot into something that felt more like a military ceremony than a civilian law enforcement encounter. Colonel Rodriguez approached Marcus with measured steps, his face serious, but his eyes showing just a hint of the satisfaction that came from executing a perfectly planned operation. When he reached Marcus, he came to attention and delivered a salute that was picture-perfect in its execution. "General Washington, sir," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent parking lot. "Colonel Rodriguez reporting as ordered. General Hayes sends her compliments and asked me to ensure that you receive the respect and courtesy befitting your rank and service to this nation." Marcus returned the salute with the same precision, feeling 32 years of military bearing flow back into his posture like water finding its level. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt like himself again, not a suspect in a parking lot, but a general officer who had earned his rank through decades of dedicated service. "Thank you, Colonel," Marcus replied. "I appreciate the prompt response." Rodriguez turned to face the police officers, his gaze settling on Hoffman with the kind of professional assessment that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "Officers, I'm here to clarify any questions you might have about General Washington's identity or credentials. His service record is impeccable. His identification is genuine, and his contributions to this nation's security are beyond question." Hoffman looked like he wanted to argue, to maintain some shred of his earlier defiance, but the sight of 6 military vehicles and a squad of soldiers in dress uniforms had apparently driven home the reality of his situation. He was no longer dealing with a lone black man in a parking lot. He was facing the full institutional weight of the United States military, and that was a fight he couldn't win. Sergeant Martinez, the female supervisor who had been making increasingly frantic radio calls, stepped forward with the kind of resigned professionalism that suggested she was trying to salvage what she could from a completely untenable situation. "Colonel, on behalf of the Millbrook Police Department, I want to apologize for this misunderstanding," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious stress of the situation. There was clearly a breakdown in communication and procedure that led to this unfortunate incident. Rodriguez nodded acknowledgement, but didn't smile. "Sergeant, I appreciate your professionalism. However, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of harassment against a decorated military officer, and it's the kind of incident that damages the relationship between civilian law enforcement and the military community." The words hit like hammer blows, each one carefully chosen for maximum impact. Marcus could see the crowd hanging on every syllable, understanding that they were witnessing something historic, a moment when institutional power was being used not to oppress, but to protect and vindicate. But even as victory seemed assured, Marcus could see that Hoffman wasn't finished. The man's face had taken on the desperate look of someone who had nothing left to lose. Someone who was about to make one final catastrophic mistake. Hoffman's hand moved toward his weapon with the jerky, unpredictable motion of a man whose world was collapsing around him. It wasn't a smooth draw. It was the desperate grab of someone who had lost all rational thought, who saw his career ending and his reputation destroyed, and wanted to take someone down with him. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. The 6 soldiers moved as one, their training taking over as they stepped forward in perfect synchronization. Colonel Rodriguez's voice cut through the air with military authority that brooked no argument. "Officer, step away from your weapon immediately." But it was Marcus who moved first, not toward safety, but toward de-escalation. 32 years of leadership had taught him that the most dangerous moments weren't always the ones that required force. Sometimes they required the kind of calm authority that could pull everyone back from the brink of disaster. "Derek," Marcus said, using Hoffman's first name deliberately, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used to talk down panicked soldiers in combat zones. "Look around you. Look at what's happening here. This doesn't have to get worse than it already is." Hoffman's hand froze halfway to his holster, his eyes darting between Marcus and the soldiers and the crowd of witnesses recording every moment. The parking lot had become a powder keg, with dozens of civilians pressed close enough to be caught in crossfire if this situation exploded into violence. "You think you're better than me," Hoffman said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You think because you've got your fancy friends and your military connections that you can just humiliate me in front of everyone. But I've been protecting this community for 15 years. 15 years of putting my life on the line while people like you sit in offices and give orders." The pain in his voice was real, Marcus realized. This wasn't just about racism or power. It was about a man who had built his entire identity around being a protector, a guardian, and was now facing the reality that he had become the very thing he thought he was fighting against. "Derek, I don't think I'm better than you," Marcus said, taking a careful step closer. I think we're both men who chose to serve our communities. The difference is that today, you forgot what that service is supposed to look like." The crowd was completely silent now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing a moment that could go either way. The news cameras were rolling, the social media streams were broadcasting live to thousands of viewers, and the entire nation was about to see how this confrontation would end. Sergeant Martinez had her own weapon drawn now, but she was pointing it at Hoffman, not at Marcus. The other officers had backed away, their faces showing the horror of professionals watching a colleague destroy himself in real time. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about the integrity of their entire department. "Officer Hoffman," Martinez said, her voice steady but urgent, "you need to stand down right now. Think about your family. Think about your pension. Don't throw away everything you've worked for because of one bad decision." But Hoffman was beyond rational thought now. Marcus could see it in his eyes, the wild look of a man who had convinced himself that he was the victim in this situation, that everyone else was wrong, and he was the only one standing up for what was right. "I know what I saw," Hoffman said, his voice rising to a shout. "I know suspicious behavior when I see it, and I don't care how many generals you know or how many soldiers show up. I'm not going to be intimidated into backing down from doing my job." It was Colonel Rodriguez who provided the reality check that finally broke through Hoffman's delusions. He stepped forward with the kind of calm confidence that came from years of dealing with volatile situations, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in actual combat zones. "Officer Hoffman, let me explain something to you," Rodriguez said. "General Washington has a security clearance that's higher than most senators. He's briefed presidents on matters of national security. He's commanded operations that saved American lives in 3 different countries. And right now, you're threatening to draw a weapon on him in front of 50 witnesses and multiple news cameras." Rodriguez paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering the final blow. "If you pull that weapon, you won't just be ending your career. You'll be committing assault on a federal official, threatening a decorated war hero, and creating an incident that will be studied in police academies for the next 50 years as an example of how not to do your job. Is that really how you want to be remembered?" The words hit Hoffman like physical blows. Marcus could see the exact moment when the reality of his situation finally penetrated the fog of anger and desperation that had been driving his actions. His hand fell away from his weapon as if it had suddenly become red-hot. The fight went out of him all at once, his shoulders sagging as the full weight of what he had almost done crashed down on him. He looked around the parking lot, at the soldiers, at his fellow officers, at the crowd of witnesses, at the news cameras, and seemed to see it all clearly for the first time. He started, then stopped, his voice failing him completely. Marcus felt a moment of genuine sympathy for the man. He'd seen soldiers break under pressure before, had watched good people make terrible decisions when they were pushed beyond their limits. Hoffman wasn't evil. He was broken, and his breaking had nearly led to tragedy. "Derek," Marcus said gently, "it's over. You can walk away from this. You can get help. But you have to choose to do it right now." Hoffman looked at him with eyes that were suddenly clear, suddenly aware of how close he had come to destroying not just his own life, but potentially the lives of everyone in that parking lot. Slowly, carefully, he reached down and unclipped his service weapon, holding it out to Sergeant Martinez with shaking hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and Marcus wasn't sure if he was talking to him, or to Martinez, or to the crowd, or to himself. "I'm so sorry. Martinez took the weapon with professional efficiency, her face showing relief that the immediate crisis had passed. The soldiers remained at attention, but Marcus could see the tension leaving their postures as the threat of violence receded. The crowd began to murmur again, phones still recording, but the atmosphere shifting from anticipation of disaster to something that felt more like the aftermath of a storm. People were beginning to process what they had witnessed, to understand that they had seen something that would be talked about and analyzed and remembered for years to come. But Marcus knew that the real resolution was still to come. This wasn't just about one officer's breakdown or one department's failure. This was about something much larger, much more fundamental to the fabric of American society. The aftermath unfolded with the kind of surreal calm that follows moments of intense crisis. Hoffman was led away by Sergeant Martinez, his head down, his career effectively over, but his life intact. The other officers dispersed with the efficient embarrassment of professionals trying to distance themselves from a colleague's spectacular failure. But the crowd remained, sensing that the story wasn't quite finished yet. Colonel Rodriguez approached Marcus with a tablet in his hands, his expression serious, but tinged with something that might have been satisfaction. "General, I have General Hayes on video call. She wanted to speak with you directly." The tablet screen flickered to life, revealing the familiar face of General Patricia Hayes in her Pentagon office. Even through the small screen, her presence commanded immediate attention from everyone within earshot. She looked directly at Marcus, her expression mixing relief with barely controlled anger. "Marcus, are you all right?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "I'm fine, Patricia. Thank you for the rapid response. It was impressive." Hayes smiled, but it was the kind of smile that suggested someone was going to pay dearly for what had happened. "When I heard what was going on, I decided that a demonstration of institutional support was in order. But Marcus, this goes beyond just supporting a colleague. What happened here today represents something that we cannot and will not tolerate." She paused, her gaze shifting to take in the crowd of onlookers, the news cameras, the social media streams that were broadcasting this moment to thousands of viewers across the country. "This incident is going to be investigated at the federal level," Hayes continued. "The Department of Justice will be looking into potential civil rights violations. The FBI will be examining whether this represents a pattern of behavior by this department. And I personally will be recommending that Congress hold hearings on the relationship between civilian law enforcement and military personnel." The implications of her words rippled through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. This wasn't just about one bad cop anymore. It was about systemic change, about accountability, about ensuring that what happened to Marcus could never happen to anyone else. But it was what happened next that truly captured the power of the moment. A young black boy, maybe 10 years old, broke away from his mother's grip and walked directly up to Marcus. He was wearing a Superman t-shirt and carrying a small American flag that he must have gotten from some recent 4th of July celebration. "Mister," the boy said, his voice clear and unafraid, "are you really a general?" Marcus knelt down to the boy's eye level, his formal military bearing softening into something warmer, more human. "I am. I was a general in the United States Army for many years. My dad says generals are the bravest soldiers of all," the boy continued. "He says they protect people and keep us safe." "Your dad is right," Marcus replied. "But you know what? Being brave isn't just for soldiers. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when people don't want to listen." The boy nodded solemnly, then did something that made every adult in the parking lot catch their breath. He handed Marcus the small American flag, his young face serious with the weight of the gesture. "This is for you," he said, "for being brave today." Marcus accepted the flag with the same reverence he had once shown when receiving medals from presidents. His hands trembled slightly as he held the small symbol, understanding that this moment, this simple exchange between a decorated general and a child who still believed in heroes, was worth more than all the military honors he had ever received. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll treasure this." The boy smiled and ran back to his mother, who was wiping tears from her eyes. Around them, the crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a sustained ovation that echoed off the buildings and carried across the parking lot like thunder. Colonel Rodriguez called his soldiers to attention, and they rendered a final salute to Marcus before beginning their withdrawal. The Humvees started up with their distinctive rumble, preparing to return to base with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. But their presence had accomplished something beyond just resolving one incident. They had sent a message that would resonate far beyond this suburban parking lot. As the military convoy departed, Marcus found himself surrounded by members of the community who wanted to shake his hand, to thank him, to apologize for what he had endured. There was Mrs. Chen, who ran the dry cleaning shop and had served coffee to soldiers at the airport during their deployments. There was Pastor Williams from the Baptist Church, who spoke about the importance of standing up to injustice. There was even Officer Patterson, the young cop who had stepped back during the confrontation, who approached with obvious nervousness to offer his personal apology. "General Washington," Patterson said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to know that not all of us, what happened today, that's not who we're supposed to be." Marcus studied the young officer's face, seeing genuine remorse and a desire to do better. "Officer Patterson, the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes. It's what they do after they realize they've made them. You have a choice now about what kind of police officer you want to be." Patterson nodded, his jaw set with new determination. "Yes, sir. I won't forget this." As the crowd began to disperse, as the news crews packed up their equipment and the social media streams ended, Marcus found himself standing alone in the parking lot where this had all begun. The summer heat was still oppressive. The asphalt still shimmered with heat waves, but something fundamental had changed. He looked down at the small American flag in his hands, thinking about the boy who had given it to him, about the faith and hope it represented. 32 years of military service had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was that the fight for justice never really ended. It just took different forms, required different kinds of courage, demanded different sacrifices. His phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter. "Dad, I just saw the video online. I'm so proud of you. You showed them what a real hero looks like." Marcus smiled, pocketing the phone and walking toward his car. He still had that bank deposit to make, still had the ordinary errands of civilian life to complete. But he also had something else now. The knowledge that when the moment came, when he was tested in a way he had never expected, he had stood firm. He had faced down hatred with dignity, had met ignorance with grace, and had shown a community what it meant to serve with honor. The parking lot returned to its normal quiet, but the ripples of what had happened there would continue to spread. Videos of the confrontation would be shared millions of times, sparking conversations about race and justice and the meaning of service. Congressional hearings would be held, policies would be changed, and Officer Derek Hoffman's name would become a cautionary tale taught in police academies across the country. But perhaps most importantly, a young boy would grow up remembering the day he met a real general, a man who showed him that true strength comes not from the power to intimidate, but from the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the whole world seems to be watching. Marcus Washington drove home that day with a small American flag on his dashboard and the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. He had served his country in war and peace, in uniform and in civilian clothes, and he would continue to serve it for as long as he drew breath. Because that's what real heroes do. They show up, they stand firm, and they remind the rest of us what we're capable of when we choose courage over comfort, justice over convenience, and hope over fear. The story of what happened in that parking lot would be told and retold, becoming part of the larger narrative of America's ongoing struggle to live up to its highest ideals. And every time it was told, people would remember that sometimes justice comes not from the courts or the legislature, but from ordinary people who refuse to accept that injustice is just the way things are. Sometimes justice comes from one phone call, one moment of courage, and the unwavering belief that in America, the truth still matters. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power we all have to stand up for what's right, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Acts of Depth for more stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit and the enduring power of justice. Because these stories matter, these moments matter, and your voice in sharing them matters too.